Hey guys, welcome back to my study live stream. Now the time is 22 o'clock 20 seconds, and we begin this moment for our study live stream. And we got a lot of things today for on our tour, and as well the big in talk, and we kind of already finished it up, and now we'll continue writing notes. And before everything started, and we're gonna yeah the email was just generalized, and welcome you guys. I don't know from where, just saw the video. I'm not very sure that you somehow that we kind of in a sense connected whatsoever. And our thing now to do is to write notes and memorize them. And so otherwise that would be fun to tell you guys how on that tour is. I don't think that's you really interested in that. But let's just do it. I think one thing I made very wrong is that since I moved here and I was insist my traditional old strategy, and afterwards they push a lot of products to the another round and said actually it is kind of very old memory and etc. So what we need is to to make a couple of ice drink, and that shouldn't be the cafe and etc. So let's just jump to the content. And I back at around 19 o'clock and etc. Why? Because there are a lot of Chinese consciousness surrounding, because they are the local store in the street and all the neighbors. I don't think so. And there are a lot of hindrance, and even kind of United States degree, like not from the Harvard but some colleges and etc. So let's prepare a little bit. And I feel like very hurtful today. I don't know why. And I give the so in my study live stream, my rules is that to at least we have now two rules in category, which is first the language, and the second one is that the content. And the first one is that we speak three languages in my YouTube channel, and one is my preferred channel language, that is English, and the second one is Chinese whenever I feel like inconfident, and the third one is German, my academic writing language in my bachelor study. And for the content, I don't have any thing to tell, but to be honest, my content based on the things which is kind of well study. Everything's what I study, and I will how to say that, whatever I have all generated the thoughts, and I will speak that into my study live stream. Some of them are very philosophical, but none of them is none of them are non-low, right? So I don't know how to describe it, but it's but the fun point is our key to achieve. Yeah, and what else? And let's kind of drive. Yeah, but I'm gonna show you guys the thing which I bought today, or later a point, because I already saw the video. I don't think it's still interesting to copy others like behaviors. I won't do that. And so yeah, so today is who I don't know, and I feel like insecure. I put my emails into the archive, and then finally I cannot find where is archive. There is no actual order in archive. But today we mean to be done several important things like for applications, and we have three universities left to apply. They need extra apply in their university website, and I feel like devastating because I hardly find time to do that. And already each university gave 30 euros for the application, but they still cannot transfer the materials in the must. They urge to separately apply, and that how got some them's organized table, and that must be ausfüllen sign. That's why, but just let's do it, okay? So, um, okay, just upon things. Cool. Let's prepare a little bit. Yeah, okay. Say that again. Today I found like so in surrounding there one empty store, and I was almost thinking that I can take over to do a bubble tea store, and then they are saying, oh, Alex Makeup can also take the new one because he can also potentially sacrifice this kind of money when that is involved in. So to be honest, if for example like this kind of money in way, and it won't affect us any, and as my previous gas million said, and so yeah, so that's oh天呐 okay. Because the cap yeah. Okay, cool, so let's do it. Okay, I don't know why today is kind of like I said, right? I have not still read the school yet, so I don't know why. And yeah. 行，我感觉没有什么要说的，然后先 celebrate for the absolutely I always when I have not celebrated any yet in the things in the things so serious, but let's celebrate for the front place of one restrictive car competition and yeah, okay, fine, it's not the first place but for him, but it's kind of um it's kind of 就这还考试，我的天呐，别想。And we won't mix it because mix this kind of action inclusive the words X. We're gonna drink one by one, and 哇，great，行，我们现在就开始吧。好好看啊！我的天呐，行，我的 PowerPoint 呢？那我们可能重新整理一下。很危险。哎，我们 usually 我们不喝那个 for f i c 但是这一学期呢有很多 game line f i c 所以我们就喝它们吧。因为我自己从来不喝这个 mark 的，但是这一学期因为我不是要又降到了 for 了嘛，然后我们就喝它们嘛，反正就有很多 for。Okay, we'll try to not talk. And set our strategy as protective instead of exposure.
what it's worth, everybody seems to have business as an outside option. That's actually like one of the most common. That is actually the most common. So you just can both become like business guys with some different first choice strategies. Okay, but so these are the results of this. What I do want to say here. The counterfactual is a trade war. We're going to take our labor supply model, we're going to embed it in a small open economy model. Industries are going to have the option of offshoring inputs. Offshore inputs differ in how substitutable they are on occupations. That's going to allow for sort of offshoring shock to occupations. There's also going to be import competition, and there's going to be export opportunities. For us, a trade war is going to be an increase in in the cost of imports by 30%, and a decline in export demand by 30%. And we're going to look at what happens if you ignore field reallocation under the current system, and then if you remove capacity constraints. And so I'll just briefly highlight the key results. One, if we don't allow for field reallocation, we get the average college of earning students declines by about 0.75%. If we allow, under the current system, we allow for limited reallocation, that income decline is reversed, right? For college educated workers, there's a decline for non-college educated workers throughout the economy. Okay. We also get substantially more reallocation. And so our first argument here is that allowing for field reallocation actually seems quantitatively to matter for not just the size, but the direction of the impact of economic shocks on workers. So being able to reallocate actually allows college educated workers to reverse what happens to them in the result of a trade. The second point I want to make in my minute here is that also the educational environment can also change our predictions for what happens after a shock in ways that would be meaningful. So if we allow for flexibility in the sense of removing these capacity constraints, we find that we find a slightly larger drop if we don't allow for allocation. That's just to do the baseline. We have a different steady state here. Importantly, when we remove constraints, we find a much smaller overall effect on the economy. This gap is much smaller, and we also find much less reallocation throughout the economy. And so we think of this as sort of saying that more flexibility in the education system makes the college educated workers overall less responsive to these sort of aggregate shocks. There's an argument here that sort of being flexible in the first place, removing these constraints in the first place, sort of allocates workers in a way that makes that initial allocation across fields more second order for the shock. And so we interpret this sort of maybe ambitiously as saying that there's something to this idea of resilience. And with that ambitious conclusion, I'll shut up there.
All right, so drinks and dinner are tomorrow. We're going to put it up again tomorrow at the beginning of the session. I think every day there's some welcome drinks for new members that everybody can go to, as long as you pay yourself. You're very welcome, and I think it's at 5:30 outside. Yeah, no. We can buy drinks to the new ones, not the NBR that does. Already, maybe you get it for free if you say that you're new.
in that sense, it is orthogonal decomposition, right? Which we, not. No, so okay, so that's it's you can prove this, but there is no closed form solution for this. So you can do what you can do. You can take the second order approximation around the efficient allocation, then you get a closed form solution. Okay, so this is how it looks like. There's no cross term. That's a corollary of this proposition, exactly. Right. Yeah, I was not even sure. Yeah, but to use this word. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Right. No. I'm just showing you precisely because if you want to kind of see how these things are determined, we will never use this to compute the welfare, right? We will do it fully nonlinear. This is just and. Right. Right, and it also has nice interpretation, right, in terms of Hardenberger triangles. So that's another thing. Right, exactly. If you can measure the elasticity of the data, in principle, you can use this approximation. Exactly. Okay, so let me show you what we get in the data, right? So we use data from World Bank. So as I said before, we just need data on output, consumption, inputs, and exports. We also use data on the real exchange rate, but this is just because I want to compare, what our risk sharing wedge to the Backus-Smith wedge. So we focus on 20 years from 2000 to 2019. Again, we have good coverage, more than 100 countries in our sample, but we can in principle go back in time. And we will do it, country by country. So we take country I and aggregate all other countries into the rest of the world. Okay, and do the risk sharing, evaluate the risk sharing for this country against the rest of the world. So the elasticities, just calibrated. We do some robustness checks. Beta is only relevant for welfare. It doesn't really, it didn't appear in any of these formulas. And we calibrate gamma and gamma star using the trade shares in the base year in 2019. So, there are a lot of details here, actually, how to implement this. So I don't have time to describe them. Let me just quickly mention two things, right? So one is that, of course, in practice, there is investment in gamma spendings. And so we kind of clean the output from these things, right? So we will keep investment and government spendings constant, take the rest of the output and see whether that part is allocated efficiently across countries. So we will figure out what is the investment of, home goods, amount of home goods used for investment, foreign goods used for investment, and we subtract this from home endowment and foreign endowment. So we keep that constant in all our kind of accounting artifactuals. And the second thing is that, kind of what we already alluded to, right, is that we will use head algebra. And the reason is that, the real variables, real consumption, real output, they are not even defined in levels, right? For a given period of time, they're not defined. They're usually defined in changes. And so we need to rewrite the whole equilibrium system, the first order conditions in terms of growth rates. It's pretty straightforward. And then you can use measures from the data. Right. And so, yes. It will be dynamics of lambda. Again, the level we can't identify separately from Pareto weight, but yes. And delta, exactly. For every period, for every country. To the rest of the world, exactly. Okay, so let me show you kind of the main results now, the main empirical results. So this is, so we start with the Backus-Smith correlation, right? The relative consumption, real exchange rate. We do it for each country over 20 years. And then this histogram shows the distribution of these correlations across countries. Okay, and I mean, it's fully consistent with the findings of the previous literature. There are no countries which have correlation close to +1, and on average it is something like -0.2, right? So that's very much consistent with previous findings. Now, what happens if we replace the real exchange rate with our measure of marginal rate of transformation, this Q tilde? Well, you can see that the whole distribution shifts rightwards, right? And the average value is now something like 0.6, and substantial fraction of countries have correlation close to 1, suggesting that the risk sharing is much better than kind of suggested by the Backus-Smith correlation. Okay, so if you look at this picture, you can start, it looks so good in a way that you can start suspecting that there is something wrong, right? Something mechanical in the whole procedure which generates this positive correlation. But that's not the case. I mean, I guess the prior should be that, if you switch from exchange rate, which is very noisy, to technological-based MRT, based on consumption and output, then probably correlations will go away from 0. But there is nothing in principle, ex ante, which guarantees that you will shift to the right rather than to the left, for example, right? And in fact, again, if you don't have to kind of believe me, you can just look at this picture, right? This is the scatter plot. Again, each point here is a separate country. The size of the point is the size of the economy. Okay, and this, you have Backus-Smith correlation here, you have our correlation here, and you can see that actually there are some countries for which the correlation goes down, right? So our measure has lower correlation than the Backus-Smith correlation. So it can happen easily. It really depends on the parameters and the co-movement. And another thing to notice here is that, so we spent much time on this trying to figure out if we can kind of predict this correlation using some simple moments in the data, right? Instead of using this whole machinery, can we maybe just estimate correlation between consumption across countries, or maybe trade balance, CPIs, things like that previous literature used? And the answer is no. So neither theoretically nor empirically can we come up with one simple moment which will capture these differences across countries, right? So in the end, you really need to calibrate the model, gamma and gamma star, and you need to take into account the whole covariance matrix of output and consumption in both countries, right? That's the way to go. This is suggested. This is only suggested, right? This is not welfare. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Exactly. Right. So that's the next step. The wedge, exactly, right. No, this is just, what is nice about correlation, this is a measure between -1 and +1, right? That's the only reason I think people like it so much, and Backus-Smith correlation is also so prominent in the literature. But of course, it's not sufficient statistic for welfare. So I'm going to show you welfare in a second, but before that, let me show you the path of wages for just a few countries. The first one is the USA, for example, and we have, so this is the Backus-Smith wedge again, this is the risk-sharing wedge, and this is the static wedge. Okay, and so there are kind of 3 takeaways from these pictures. The first one is that if you look at the static wedge, it's pretty flat for most countries. Okay, I mean, Switzerland will be different, but Switzerland is different in almost all pictures. But for most countries, the static wedge, it's not 0. Actually, the level of delta wedge, which we can identify, is very far from 0. But in terms of dynamic, it doesn't play an important role. So that's the takeaway, number one. The second, right. So this is where the calibration, right. Okay. So this is kind of a detail. So the way we do it, right, we can look at the ratio of imports to GDP, and we can look at using PPP adjustments for the base year only. We can kind of do what Darren also showed today, like identify the quantities, try to identify the quantities. What is the export to GDP in terms of quantities rather than values? And so it turns out that these 2 things, they are sufficient to identify delta in the base year, the level of delta. Okay, but yeah, so it probably sounds a little bit mysterious, and yeah, it would take much time to explain. But so delta you can identify in levels if you believe in these PPP adjustments in the base year. So it's as if you have these prices. Okay, so the second main takeaway is that if you look at lower frequencies, if you just look at trends, in some sense, the Backus-Smith wedge and our measure of risk-sharing wedge, they kind of tell the same stories, right? So for most countries, they kind of move in the same direction at least, and the magnitudes are comparable at least, right? So, and that's, again, it's nothing new here, right? Like again in Heathcote and Perry handbook chapter, there was already much evidence that countries don't really share risk at lower frequencies, right? There's almost no evidence of risk sharing at lower frequencies. But at high frequencies, and that's observation number 3, right? So suppose I look at the same objects, but in first differences. So at high frequencies, there are big differences between the Backus-Smith wedge and the risk-sharing wedge, right? So the Backus-Smith wedge is much more volatile for almost all countries than the risk-sharing wedge. And so in that sense, you will kind of, if you just look at the Backus-Smith wedge, you will overestimate the losses from risk-sharing at higher frequencies. And so let me finally show you, the welfare metric, right? So suppose that we do the following counterfactual. We shut down lambda, okay, the movements in lambda. We don't know the level as we discussed. So what we're going to do, we will calibrate kind of the levels so that the welfare of the rest of the world doesn't change in the counterfactual. So it remains exactly the same. And all welfare gains from better risk sharing are allocated to the home economy. Okay, and then we can do the same exercise for psi, for the Backus-Smith wedge, but this will be partial equilibrium, right? So we will keep the real exchange rate, foreign consumption constant. So it's as if you take one household, and for that household, you give full access to full risk sharing and shut down this wedge. And so here's what you get again for this kind of selected sample of countries. So what you can see here is that, of course, there's large variation across countries, right? It depends on the openness of the economies, it depends on the volatility of shocks. But for almost all countries here, you can see that the Backus-Smith wedge overpredicts the losses from this wedge relative to the true international risk-sharing wedge, right? So there's, again, Switzerland is an exception, but for all other countries, there are substantial differences. And, again, the more you go to the right, you can see that, it becomes 2, 3, sometimes 5 times differences. So, one thing I should mention is that this is kind of the total losses, right? So including both high frequency and low frequency movements in these wedges. You can say that maybe we shouldn't trust this low frequency trends very much. What if countries, for example, have different discount factors, right? Countries. The rest of the world, aggregated rest of the world. And yes. Country by country. We could, but that would require additional assumptions for identification. But in principle, yes. Yeah. So, here you just need, for each country, you have 2 wedges, right? The question is, once you have n by n countries, right? Whether you should, for example, delta wedge, right? Whether it stays still, n, or it becomes n squared. That's, no, we never take a stand on omega, right?
This starts at 6:30, right? 6:30, yeah.
So then,
Yes.
lunch tomorrow?
Yeah.
Do you have an appointment?
Yes. Yeah, I don't want to shoot out the video. I certainly don't want that. I don't want to. I just voice over there. Yeah.
So, very negative.
That's very hard. Yeah. Okay.
Right here.
What time do you have to leave?
Right.
Yeah. Very.
That's a bit of an issue, yeah. Yes. Right. Okay, let me just finish with welfare. So suppose that instead of shutting lambda or psi fully, instead we allow for trends, right? So we focus on the welfare gains from shutting down high frequency volatility in these objects. So in other words, we still keep the same trend, right? We calibrated, given observed dynamics of lambda, but it stays constant, right? There are no high frequency fluctuations. So then the numbers are smaller, but then you can also see that the differences between what psi wedge tells you and lambda wedge tell you is very different, right? The difference between red bars and blue bars is much larger. And that's exactly because lambda is much more stable at high frequency than psi, than the Backus-Smith wedge. Yes, right. Or real. Yeah. Yeah, it's mostly the same thing. Mm-hmm.
You're trying to expand something and not get exactly all of it. And I should have simulated data and let everything be efficient for the political reason. Use those preferences.
Yeah. I would say it depends, right? I mean, if you have low elasticity of substitution between home and foreign goods, then in principle you can think of home good as non-tradable. It kind of becomes similar to that, no? But
yeah, we will know that the driven we experiment with the process for that. We've also done a lot of the analytics. We call it analytics stuff for creative on trade.
that's much easier, yeah.
Let me do it. Yes. What you did in the screens of letting the delta ITs, the country IT, do whatever to do the best that they can. Well, not the reason. To justify the data. And then only do residual about that. They would have used like that.
Right, but exactly, and
But it does reach is the share of trade.
right, but again, I would argue. Sorry. But let me just add to that, right? Again, so like at low frequency, I think many things can change, and we're working on the robustness checks for that. But I think at high frequencies, right, like this expansion of non-tradable sector or changes in trade costs, that's probably less likely at business cycle frequencies. And this is where exactly this psi wedge and lambda wedge are most different.
And you're saying the delta is pretty fast. Doesn't have a delta too much. For a country like China, we do this trade.
Okay, so this is the empirical evidence, right? So it seems like the resharing is not that bad in cross countries, right? And that raises the question: so how can we support such allocation as an equilibrium outcome, given that, as we just saw, right, the exchange rate, the relative prices are very different. Okay, and so kind of in the last part of the paper, we come back to this question and we write a simple and fairly general decentralized model. Okay, and so the equilibrium is described by two equilibrium conditions, one for the asset markets, another one is for the goods markets. So for the asset markets, you can kind of nest all these models with different types of financial frictions by just writing the Backus-Smith condition, right? So the MRS is exactly the same as before, but on the right-hand side, and this is different from the planner's problem, we have the real exchange rate, right? So private agents, when they sign contracts in dollars about risk sharing, for them, the relevant object is the real exchange rate, right? So they compare how many units of goods they can buy in one country with the dollar, how many units of goods they can buy with the dollar in another country, right? And so the real exchange rate reflects exactly these relative prices. And so if there were no financial frictions, right, of course, then the psi would be equal 0, and they would households would just equalize margin rate of substitution with the real exchange rate. I will focus on the difference between psi and lambda, but of course, given that this comes from the Planner's problem, of course, it's the same as focusing on the difference between Q and MRT. Okay, so what about goods markets? Again, just to nest, many models that people wrote to understand frictions in those markets will allow for markup shocks. Okay, and so we have we follow the standard convention. All prices are expressed in the currency of the buyer. Okay, so PH and PF are the prices of two goods in the home economy. In domestic currency, PH star and PF star are the price of those goods abroad in foreign currency. So we need to multiply them by the nominal exchange rate to convert into the same units. But then there are still deviations from the law of one price because of these markups. Okay? And so the question then is how to map these distortions in the decentralized equilibrium, including the Backus-Smith wedge, into the Planner's wedges that I showed you before. And so for the static wedge, the answer is very simple, right? So it turns out that this delta wedge is just the ratio of these two law of one price deviations. In other words, you can kind of divide one equation by the other, right? And you will see that this ratio corresponds to differences in relative price across the countries, right? You have relative price of home and foreign good at home, the same relative, the relative price of home and foreign goods abroad. And if they are different, right, if they fluctuate, that will show up as a delta wedge. Now, what is the risk sharing wedge, right? How can we map this into lambda? Well, in general case, it's actually quite hard. There's no closed form solution, but kind of partly motivated by the fact that in the data delta is stable, we can kind of focus on the case when mu h and mu f are the same, and then delta wedge is equal 0, and then we get this expression. Okay, so then you can see that the risk sharing wedge depends on both the Backus-Smith wedge and the markup wedge in the goods markets. Okay, so it's not just the financial wedge which shows up here, but also the distortion in the goods markets. And let me kind of give you three special cases, 3 examples, which to kind of build intuition. So the first one is really trivial, and this is where the literature started back in 1990s. So if there are no low one price deviations, if these markups are just relative markups are equal 0, then you get the Backus-Smith result, right? You get that lambda wedge can be approximated, right? It's actually exactly equal to the Backus-Smith wedge. So looking at psi, measuring this psi in the decentralized equilibrium is sufficient to evaluate the risk sharing across categories. But once you deviate from that benchmark, it's no longer the case that psi is informative about the risk sharing. And in particular, you can take